For those of us here in person and online, welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Brent Holmes, and I have the privilege of serving as the acting director of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies here at Grand Valley State University. Over the last week and a half, we have watched campus explode with excitement as the fall semester has begun. Here at the Hauenstein Center, we too are excited to kick off this academic year with our first event. This evening's event would not be possible without the continued generous support of our donors. Hauenstein Center memberships are a vital part in our ability to continue fulfilling Colonel Ralph W. Hauenstein's vision of raising up a community of ethical, effective leaders for the 21st century. We accomplish this important mission through programming like this evening and the work being completed in the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. To learn more about membership or to renew your membership, please speak to a Hauenstein Center staff member. Tonight, Hal Brands will provide a keynote presentation followed by a question and answer session from the audience. Hauenstein Center staff will be in the aisles with handheld microphones. Our new Common Ground program manager, Kaylor Sweeney, will wrap the evening up with closing remarks. One of the favorite parts of my job is when I get the opportunity to interact with our fellow candidates in the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. I now have the privilege to introduce one of those fellow candidates who will share a leadership minute and introduce our featured speaker. Dawson Coates is a senior here at Grand Valley State University studying mechanical engineering. At a young age, Dawson had a passion for STEM and leadership. During his time at Grand Valley, he has put a strong emphasis on the Formula SAE team designing the first aerodynamics package for the team and serving as their president for their most ambitious year yet. Right now, Dawson is focused on using both his leadership and engineering skills to develop what he calls Michigan Launch Alliance, an initiative that will bridge the gap between industry and academia through applicable senior capstone projects. Please join me in welcoming Dawson.
My name is Dawson Coates, as was mentioned, and I've had the pleasure of serving 2 years as a fellow candidate with 1 year as a lead fellow within the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. I'm excited to be up here today, and I'm honored to be able to represent CLA and all the absolutely amazing things that this fellowship has to offer. As a leader, I find myself distracted by the ever-revolving world and sometimes struggle to just take a second and breathe. It's always so easy to get caught up in life and forget the amazing things that we've accomplished as ourselves. I want to reflect on a conversation I once had with my grandfather, who has always been an inspiration to me and has pushed me beyond my limits to truly craft who I am today. When I was 14, my priorities often revolved around things besides school. My grades definitely reflected that. I remember my grandfather putting his hand on my shoulder and a finger to my nose and telling me that the most important thing I needed to do was focus. It's a word that seems quite obvious, and honestly at the time was taken more as a threat than any jaw-dropping wisdom. In my early years, I shrugged this advice off, but would quickly be reminded of the same word, focus. It wasn't until I came to college that the wisdom really resonated with me. I would from time to time keep getting the same advice, even though now my grades are just fine. And finally, it clicked within me. My grandfather, who once probably just thought my grades were poor and I should get a grip and focus, saw my impulsiveness as fixation, only looking at what is in the moment. So through the years, his advice and perception weren't as fixated as I made them out to be. They were instead a subtle reminder that being fixated and focused are not the same thing, and that the focus that he encouraged in me was to focus on the little things, to take a second and breathe. Moving from fixation to focus has allowed me to reflect on the things I've done, people I've met, and the life I have to admire. As I look beyond my time at Grand Valley, I know my focus will allow me to dream bigger and achieve more than 14-year-old me could ever imagine. My name is Dawson Coates, and I'm a leader. It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. Hal Brands is the Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He is also a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. He has authored and co-authored several books, including his newest books, The Twilight Struggle, What the Cold War Teaches Us About the Great-Power Rivalry Today, and Danger Zone, The Coming Conflict with China. Hal served as a special assistant to the Secretary of Defense for strategic planning from 2015 to 2016. He has also served as lead writer for the Commission on the National Defense Strategy for the United States. He is currently a member of the State Department's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. Please join me in welcoming Hal.
Well, thank you, Dawson, for that intro, and to Brent and everybody at the Hauenstein Center for having me. I'd like to thank also the Hauenstein family for creating this remarkable institution and all the supporters of the center for making this possible. It's a pleasure to be here at such a nice time of year, and in fact, I'm particularly delighted to be here in September when the weather is beautiful and not in February when it's a bit colder, in part because this actually gives me a little bit of a leg up on my old man. And so as some of you know, my father has been a speaker in this forum a few times. History and writing is sort of the family business in the Brands family. And I know he's always enjoyed coming up here, but the way he tells it, he's typically coming up here in the dead of winter. And so I'm feeling pretty good about my place in the family pecking order, at least for tonight. The only thing I'm not feeling great about is my voice. I managed to pick the worst possible time to get a case of laryngitis. So please bear with me as I do this combination of kind of a growl and a whisper up here, and as I slug down a little bit of water from time to time. So with all that as prelude, let me get into the subject of my talk tonight. And the subject is really related to one of the books that Dawson mentioned, a book called The Twilight Struggle. And I think I'll start by explaining what the metaphor in the title means. And for some of the folks in the audience, you may remember that this is a metaphor that John Kennedy used to describe the Cold War in a speech that he gave in 1961. He referred to the US-Soviet Cold War as a long twilight struggle. And I think that the metaphor would have been obvious to most people who heard the speech at the time. Twilight, of course, is neither day nor night. It's neither light nor dark. Just as the Cold War was neither war nor peace for the United States. The Cold War was not a global hot war of the type that the United States had just fought in World War II less than a generation before, although there were plenty of hot wars that were part of the Cold War. But the Cold War wasn't anything like peace as Americans had traditionally known it either. The Cold War was a time of persistently elevated diplomatic and military tensions. It was a time when the United States manned frontiers half a world away to protect vulnerable countries from potential Soviet or communist aggression. It was a time when the United States developed a national security state unlike anything it had ever had in peacetime before. It wasn't a hot war, but it was not what Americans would have considered peace being even 20 years earlier. It was sort of this weird in-between state, this state that was in between normal international interactions and the sort of wars that had convulsed the international system in the early 20th century. And that metaphor is useful because I actually think it describes sort of where we are today. Today, the United States is waging two twilight struggles, one against China and the other against Russia. I think it's become fairly clear in recent years that China has the ambition to fundamentally remake the international system, not simply to make China whole again, as Xi Jinping might have it, and pull Hong Kong and Taiwan back into the PRC's embrace, but to become the dominant power in Asia and perhaps eventually the world. It's hard to see how that can be accomplished without a fairly fundamental collision with the United States and its allies. Russia obviously is less powerful. I don't wake up in a cold sweat at night worrying about living in a Russo-centric world 20 years from now, but I think we've seen in Ukraine that Russia can create a fair amount of destruction along the way. Certainly, Vladimir Putin is seeking to recreate something like a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet space. He's trying to roll back NATO and the European Union to where they would have been in the mid-1990s. He made that very clear in some of the demands he made of the West prior to the invasion of Ukraine. And again, it's fairly difficult to see how Vladimir Putin can accomplish his geopolitical objectives without coming into a degree of competition and perhaps conflict with the United States and its allies. Now, so far in both cases, both of these competitions have occurred mostly below the threshold of outright war. And so when we think about the US-Russia competition, we think about cyber attacks, we think about information warfare. When we think about the US-China competition, we might think about China's kind of creeping aggression in the South China Sea over the past decade, or perhaps the rivalry to dominate the world's 5G telecommunications networks. But in both cases, these competitions are occurring in the shadow of war. Both Russia and China have undertaken major military modernization programs over the last 2 decades, or even more in China's case. We've seen, obviously, Vladimir Putin launch a hot war in Ukraine that comes with the danger of escalation into a larger conflict. And we've seen from the crisis that just unfolded in the Taiwan Strait about a month ago in response to Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, that the potential for conflict in the Western Pacific is hardly trivial either. And in fact, neither Russian nor Chinese leaders are talking like they expect peace to be preserved for years and years to come. Xi Jinping chose to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party in 2021 by saying that anyone who gets in the way of China's rejuvenation will have their head bashed bloody against a great wall of steel. Vladimir Putin and his acolytes have talked about bringing about a transition to a post-Western world, which will presumably come in with a lot of chaos and violence. And so this is really the situation that the United States and other like-minded countries around the world face today. And it's obviously not desirable. It's a dangerous world. It's a world that is fraught with potential for conflict. That's the bad news. The good news is that we have seen this sort of competition before. Where I live in Washington, D.C., we often talk about great power rivalry or great power competition or whatever you want to call it as something that is new. I would say it only seems new because it's actually very old. What we're seeing today is normal. Long-term extended competitions between geopolitical and ideological rivals is as old as history itself. You can go back to the Athens-Sparta competition in the 5th century BC. You could look at the rivalry between Napoleon and his enemies in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. You can look at the Anglo-Russian Great Game or the Anglo-German competition in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. You can look, of course, at the US-Soviet Cold War as well. Some of these rivalries turned hot. Others stayed cold. There's no rule or natural law that determines which goes in which category. But all of them have something to teach us about this larger issue of great power competition. And I think that's especially true of the US-Soviet Cold War. Now, when I talk about the relevance of the Cold War, I think it's useful to confront the obvious objection or counter-argument up front. And that is that the US competition with China or with Russia just isn't the same as the US-Soviet competition was during the Cold War. And I think that is true enough. The geography is different. The US-China competition is going to play out primarily in the Western Pacific, whereas the US-Soviet rivalry had its central theater, at least for the first couple of decades, in Central Europe. The players are different. Xi Jinping is not Mao Zedong. Vladimir Putin is not Joseph Stalin, even if both of them take on more Maoist or Stalinist tendencies every day. The setting is not the same. Today, we often talk about a world order that is under strain. In the late 1940s, the Soviet threat was so dangerous because there was no world order. There was the prospect of chaos and starvation in regions around the globe. China poses a technological threat, an economic threat that I think it's safe to say that the Soviet Union never posed. The nature of the ideological challenge is different today than it was in, say, the 1950s. And so I don't want you to think that I'm saying that today's competitions are the same as what happened in the past or that we can prevail in them simply by running the same playbook. I don't think that is the case at all. But nonetheless, I would say there are 3 good reasons to study the Cold War and thinking about how we should understand US-China and US-Russia competition today. The first of these is that the Cold War itself just wasn't that unique. Yes, there were aspects of it that were unique or even unprecedented. There had never been a rivalry conducted in the shadow of nuclear weapons before. The Cold War was more global than many of the rivalries that had preceded it. But it was just it was one manifestation of this longer running trend of rivalry between the most powerful countries in the international system. Rivalries that involve the danger of war, even if hopefully they don't spill into war. If Thucydides, who wrote about the Athens-Sparta clash, had somehow been reincarnated in the middle of the 20th century, he would have had no difficulty understanding what was going on between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so if we can learn from the past, then it stands to reason that we can learn a lot from a struggle as epic as the Cold War about the nature of great power competition and perhaps what it takes to succeed in that today. The second reason is that I'm an American, and in American history, there just aren't that many examples of long-term, protracted geopolitical competition with an authoritarian great power. There are either one or two examples of this in our history, depending on how you count. And in fact, the Cold War occurred within the living memory of a number of American policymakers. I guarantee that Joe Biden, for instance, has an understanding of the Cold War that shapes, for better or worse, how he responds to a variety of different issues today. So the Cold War is going to be the historical example that we think of because it's the one that's most prominent for us. And so we might as well spend some time really learning what it has to teach us about these issues. And then the third reason is that, well, the Cold War is not a perfect analog for what we face today. It's not a terrible analog either. The Cold War was a struggle over the terms of world order. The Cold War was a struggle that had both geopolitical and ideological components. It was about which ideas would triumph, as well as which nation would triumph. It presented a lot of challenges, like how do you forge a long-term strategy that can survive even amid continual crises and challenges? How do you orchestrate a diverse and fractious coalition of countries? How do you blend competition and negotiation? All of these things are going to be challenges that the United States will have to confront in the coming years. And so if we look back at the Cold War, we can get a sense, even if only at a broad level, about what it may take to succeed in the challenges the United States faces today. And in fact, the whole point of learning from history is this idea that you can draw lessons from past that never looks quite like the present. It never looks exactly the same. This was something that Cold War statesmen understood, I think. In early 1947, George Marshall went to Princeton University to give a talk on leadership, a subject that Dawson just talked about there. And he basically said, I don't think anyone can understand what is happening between the US and the Soviet Union who has not studied the Great Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. Dean Acheson, when he was trying to persuade skeptical senators and congressmen to support Truman Doctrine to Greece and Turkey in 1947, liked to use the analogy of Rome and Carthage, of a polarized system with two superpowers. Cold War statesmen understood that the past had lessons it could teach us about a present that was inevitably somewhat different than anything had come before. And I think we need that same historical consciousness today. So what I try to do in the book is to draw out a number of lessons. I think the number is 12 that we can learn from the Cold War in thinking about the Russian and Chinese challenges. I'm not going to go through all 12 for reasons of time. What I do want to do is just present a handful of them as a way of teeing up what I hope will be a fun discussion of these issues. And so the first lesson I would point to is the importance of having a theory of victory, a sense of what you are trying to achieve and how. And I think this is a good point to bring up George Kennen, a figure who has to loom large in any history of the Cold War. George Kennen was America's foremost Sovietologist during the early Cold War. He had spent 20 years studying the Soviet Union. He was a high-ranking American diplomat in Moscow at the end of World War II and immediately after. He was also one of America's first grand strategists in the context of the Cold War. And he wrote two documents, the long telegram from Moscow in 1946 and the so-called X article in Foreign Affairs in 1947, that we still look at as seminal state papers in the development of US policy during the Cold War. And the reason that we still can read these papers profitably isn't that they contain lots of detailed policy prescriptions. They don't. You won't find a detailed prescription for how the United States should deal with the crisis in Iran in 1946, for instance. What you will see is a lot of diagnosis of the problem. And so Kennen argued that the Soviet Union could not be appeased, it could not be reasoned with, because the combination of Russian history, communist ideology and Stalinist paranoia just made the Soviet Union essentially unappeasable. But he also argued that the Soviet Union was a patient power, a power that could be deterred, it could be contained. The Soviets were not in a hurry to overturn the capitalist world. Stalin understood that the Soviet Union was weaker than the United States. And so this led Kennen to his theory of success in the Cold War. He basically said, if the United States can hold the line against Soviet expansion, if it can moderately increase the pressures on the Soviet Union, it can disprove the Soviet thesis that the capitalist world will collapse and that communism will triumph. And over time, that will lead to the breakup or mellowing of Soviet power. This was a theory of the case. It was a thinking about what destination the United States should aim for, what our strategic objective should be, and how, in a broad sense, to get there. How we could use a certain strategy to bring about a better status quo in our relationship with a dangerous enemy. This is relevant because I think this is something that we're lacking today. The last two presidential administrations have rightly said that the United States is in a state of competition with China. But competition is really more a description of international reality than it is a strategy. And there's been less clarity around what exactly we are trying to achieve vis-a-vis China. Are we trying to build the leverage that would allow us to come up with some grand bargain that would resolve US-Chinese tensions? Do we think that we should just hold the line indefinitely and see what happens? Do we think that we need to bring about the overthrow of the communist regime in China? You can make arguments for and against all of these theories, but we really don't have a lot of clarity, at least at a public level, on what it is the United States seeks to achieve in this competition. I think there's good reasons for that. I think these are sensitive questions. There are diplomatic sensitivities around them. But ultimately, these are questions that we will have to answer, because I think it's dangerous to set out on a long geopolitical journey without knowing what your destination is. So that's a first lesson of the Cold War. A second lesson would be that the balance of military power shapes risk-taking and decision-making. So during the Cold War, there were long debates about whether the military balance, and particularly the nuclear balance, mattered, whether you had some advantage from having more military power, more nuclear warheads than the other side, or whether it was all just pointless after a certain level of potential destruction. There was a great political scientist, a man named Robert Jervis, who just died about a year ago, who weighed in on this, and he wrote an article in the late 1970s that was titled, "Why Nuclear Superiority Doesn't Matter." Basically, the argument was that after a certain point, it's just who can make the rubble bounce higher. But with respect to Professor Jervis, I think he was wrong. I think that the military balance did matter tremendously during the Cold War because it shaped perceptions of geopolitical advantage and thus the willingness to run risk in the crises that characterized the Cold War. And I can give you a handful of examples of this. During the late 1940s, the US atomic monopoly, the fact that the United States had nuclear weapons and the Soviet Union didn't, was critical to giving the Truman administration the confidence to do things like the Marshall Plan or the creation of NATO that were sure to antagonize the Soviet Union. The atomic bomb was sort of an insurance policy that if war broke out, the United States would be okay because it had a monopoly in the world's most powerful weapon. A decade and a half later, when you got to the crises over Berlin in the late 1950s and early 1960s, or over Cuba in 1962, it was the US knowledge that the United States actually had a significant military superiority when it came to strategic nuclear warheads that gave Dwight Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy the confidence they needed to calmly but firmly turn back Soviet challenges to the status quo. If you look at the surge of Soviet aggressiveness in the 1970s in parts of the Third World, it was not unrelated to the fact that the Soviet Union had finally developed a global power projection capability that could rival the United States. And if you look at the end of the Cold War, and if you look at some of the arms control agreements, such as the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty that helped bring the Cold War to an end, the fact that the United States was able to get such good deals on those treaties was indicative of the fact that it had conducted a major military buildup during the late 1970s and early and mid-1980s that gave it a position of greater leverage vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. It wasn't that US policymakers wanted war. It wasn't that they expected war. It was that policymakers on both sides of the Iron Curtain understood that the balance of military power shaped how far you could go and how much risk you could run and how much pressure you could apply short of war as well. I think this is particularly important today because in critical areas, the balance of military power has been shifting against us. And the place I would point to in particular is in the Western Pacific. The military balance in the Western Pacific has been eroding for about a quarter century now. I think it's now sort of open for debate as to whether the United States would be successful in helping Taiwan, for instance, beat back an attack by the People's Republic of China. There are profound concerns about what the military balance might be a decade from now if the United States doesn't shore up its position, if U.S. allies don't shore up their position. And I think there are real concerns about whether the United States has enough aggregate military power to deal with all of the threats that it faces around the world, because of course we face not just the threat from China in the Western Pacific, but also from Russia and Eastern Europe, and perhaps from Iran in the Persian Gulf, in addition to other actors as well. We can all debate what the United States should do to address that problem, what capabilities it should field, what weapons it should buy, how much it should spend on defense. The point I would make here simply is that if the military balance continues to erode, bad things will happen. Bad actors will feel emboldened. The United States and its allies will feel more constrained. We will ultimately pay a price for finding ourselves in a position of military weakness in theaters that we have deemed crucial to American security. So that will be a second lesson. A third lesson is that we should see negotiation as a tool of competition, not a replacement for it. So one thing that the history of the Cold War makes very clear is that diplomacy and arms control, it's not silly peacenik stuff. It can actually be a really important aspect of a strategy of competition. During the Cold War, every American president met with his Soviet counterpart at the summit. The United States and the Soviet Union came to agreements on a variety of things, from nuclear arms control to agreements to limit the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries to a variety of other issues. More often than not, there was some diplomatic process ongoing between the United States and its Cold War rivals. And this was because US policymakers understood that diplomacy and negotiation could serve important strategic purposes. It could reduce the danger of war at the margin. American policymakers were sophisticated. They didn't think that the Cold War was going to go away just because they sat down and talked to Soviet policymakers. They did hope, though, that it would be possible to limit the most dangerous aspects of the competition and try to keep the competition from going hot. And one of the ways they did so, actually, was through an agreement that was never set down on paper. It was a tacit, an implicit agreement not to shoot down the other side's orbiting reconnaissance satellites. And the reason that the United States and the Soviet Union did this is because they realized it was dangerous for the other side not to have any idea what you were doing, because they might worry that you were getting ready to launch a surprise attack, and they might decide that they needed to go first in launching a surprise attack. And so it was actually better in a crisis over the Middle East in 1973, for instance, for the Soviets to be able to tell that the United States wasn't getting ready to launch a surprise attack, or vice versa. It could introduce a level of stability into the confrontation. This was never set down in a formal treaty, but it was profoundly important in terms of introducing a degree of stability into the Cold War. Another purpose of negotiation would have been to isolate areas where the US and the Soviet Union actually shared common interests. Both countries shared an interest in preventing lots and lots of other countries around the world from getting nuclear weapons, because regardless of their geopolitical differences or the clash between communism and capitalism, neither country had an interest in living in a world of nuclear anarchy. And so the two superpowers got together in the late 1960s, and they basically hatched a bargain. They signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and then they went out and pushed their allies to sign up to it as well. So countries like West Germany or East Germany would not attain nuclear weapons. They even cooperated to do things like eradicating smallpox in the developing world. So there were a number of areas where the superpowers were basically able to compartmentalize their difference and find areas of cooperation. And then negotiation could be a way of getting strategic advantage as well. One of the reasons that Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon pursued détente, a relaxation of tensions, the pursuit of arms control with the Soviet Union in the late 60s and early 1970s, was to give the United States a breather after the Vietnam War. And one of the real benefits of the approach they took was actually to give the United States a greater degree of strategic advantage in the arms race. And so the agreements that were signed in 1972, particularly the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, basically ended the numeric arms race. Both sides were capped on how many strategic nuclear delivery vehicles, intercontinental bombers, ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, they could have. But what that meant was that the quality of your missiles, the quality of your bombers became more important. And that was an area in which the United States was going to excel because of its high-tech advantages. And so arms control and negotiation could actually be a way of giving the United States the strategic edge in this rivalry. We need to be thinking about diplomacy and negotiation in the same way today. We should not assume that we can transcend our differences with Russia or China simply by sitting down with Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping. I don't think we should assume that cooperation on climate change, for instance, is going to fundamentally change the larger US-China relationship. And I don't think that we should make concessions on geopolitical issues like Taiwan in order to try to entice the Chinese to cooperate with us on issues like pandemic prevention or addressing climate change. And finally, we have to keep in mind that both Russia and China have a long history of signing international agreements and then cheating egregiously on them. What we should do is patiently explore potential areas of cooperation. We should think about areas where unconstrained competition may not serve our interests, so the marrying of advanced technologies like artificial intelligence with nuclear weapons, for instance. We should think about diplomacy as a way of inserting pauses in the competition at times when we need a break. We should basically think about negotiation as a way of making the competition a little bit safer, a little bit more tolerable for the United States so that we're willing to stick with it long enough to win it. That would be a third lesson. A fourth lesson would be the best way to win a bilateral competition is by competing multilaterally. Or another way to put that is that the best outside game is actually a good inside game. The most effective thing the United States did during the Cold War wasn't something it did to the Soviet Union. It was something it did with its own friends. And this was creating a network of alliances that bound the United States together with some of the most productive democracies in the world. It was creating a thriving free world community. It was rehabilitating its former enemies in West Germany and Japan, and basically creating a non-communist community that was strong enough and vibrant enough that the Soviet Union could not outlast it, could not intimidate it, could not outcompete it. This was a tremendous achievement when you looked at the path of the capitalist world in, say, the 40 years leading up to 1945. It had repeatedly torn itself apart in not one but two world wars. Dwight Eisenhower liked to say that the first half of the 20th century often appeared as though it had been scripted by Karl Marx because the capitalist world was just tearing itself apart. And the United States facilitated this. It did so by providing security in key regions. It did so by coordinating collective action on problems like the rehabilitation of Europe after World War II. It did so by promoting democratic values in the countries it had just defeated. It wasn't easy. This wasn't always a matter of simply being nice to our allies. U.S. relations with our allies could be pretty bare-knuckled affairs during the Cold War. We now know, for instance, that if the Soviet Union had invaded and overrun Western Europe during the 1950s, the United States was perfectly prepared to send nuclear weapons to destroy its own allies' industrial capacity rather than seeing that harnessed to the Soviet war machine. The Allies could give as good as they got. Charles de Gaulle famously withdrew France from NATO's Unified Military Command in 1966 because he knew that the United States still had no alternative but to protect France and protecting Germany. And he told Dean Rusk, the American Secretary of State, that for France to regain its sovereignty, every American soldier had to leave French soil. And that led to one of the great ripostes of the Cold War era, where Rusk asked if that included the Americans in the military cemeteries in Normandy as well. So there was a lot of tension between the United States and its allies, but what American policymakers understood was that working with allies was always better than working without them. Being somewhat generous and tolerant in your relationships with allies would pay off handsomely in the end. And again, this is an important lesson for us today. Alliances are America's asymmetric edge, its secret sauce in the competitions with Russia and China. If you add up the United States plus its treaty allies in Europe and in the Asia Pacific, we dramatically outstrip Russia and China put together in economic power and military power and diplomatic power in whatever dimension of power you want to measure it. If these alliances hold together, the United States and its allies will win in the end, which is why Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping try so hard to create wedges between the United States and its allies. They realize that is their path to victory. Maintaining these alliances, strengthening them is not easy. It involves continual work. We're constantly having to adapt these relationships so that they are relevant to the challenges that the United States faces, say in its competition with China, where the issue may be, how do we ensure that the United States and other democratic countries maintain a technological edge vis-a-vis China? But this is absolutely critical to success. And I will give the Biden administration a little bit of credit here. I think the Biden administration has done a very good job of alliance management in the context of the war in Ukraine and warning the allies and others beforehand what was coming and coordinating a diplomatic and economic and military response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and bringing together countries not just in Europe but in East Asia, such as Japan, as well, and as part of the sanctions coalition. I think this has been a really good example of how to leverage America's relationships with its allies to achieve good outcomes. A fifth lesson: you can't win a Twilight Struggle on the defensive. And so George Kennen was often frustrated by the suggestion that containment was a purely defensive doctrine, that it just kind of involved sitting back and waiting for the Soviet Union to collapse, because that wasn't the case at all. The United States actually did a lot of things during the Cold War to try to put pressure on the Soviet Union, to weaken its control of its allies, even to complicate its own internal security. The United States ran covert paramilitary operations in Eastern Europe and even in places like Ukraine in the late 1940s and early 1950s. It ran information operations in the Eastern Bloc through Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty throughout the Cold War. It conducted Reagan Doctrine programs in the 1980s to try to put pressure on either the Soviets when they were in Afghanistan or Soviet client states in places like Nicaragua. Some of these policies worked really well. Some of them were utter failures. But the United States did all of these things with strategic purposes in mind. American policymakers understood that they had to avoid unilateral disarmament and dealing with a foe that wouldn't hesitate to try to undermine and weaken the Western world. They understood it was important to impose costs on the Soviet Union, to make it harder for the Soviet Union to remain competitive over time. They understood that it was important to highlight the moral asymmetry between a coalition that mostly included free and democratic states and one that was based on the suppression of human freedom in the Soviet bloc. The goal of this was never to overthrow the Soviet regime. I think American policymakers from Eisenhower to Reagan understood that would be quite dangerous. The goal was to throw the Soviet Union on the defensive and raise the costs it had to pay to remain in the competition with the United States. And I think that's the formula the United States needs to follow in the coming years. We should not seek to overthrow governments in Russia or China. We should seek to impose greater costs on them. We should publicize the corruption of the Russian and the Chinese regimes and the strains that creates within those regimes. We should find ways of hacking and undermining the digital control systems that China in particular has been deploying to maintain an iron grip on its own population. We should find ways of simply sticking up for our own best values by sanctioning Chinese officials who are involved in horrific human rights abuses in places like Xinjiang and Hong Kong. All of this is a recipe for heightened tensions. I think it's also a recipe for being effective in a long struggle as well. And this brings me to my final point, which is that all of the things I've talked about probably don't make the coming years sound like they're going to be a whole lot of fun. This is all a recipe for high tensions, for a lot of danger, for all the things that people didn't like for good reason about the initial Cold War. But I think the last lesson I would point to is this one. There are worse things than having to wage a Twilight Struggle. No one particularly loved containment, the American strategy during the Cold War at the time. Containment was a plodding strategy. It seemed indecisive. It seemed like it was going to go on for years and years and decades as it did. It seemed to combine perpetual danger with perpetual indecision. And so containment was critiqued from the very outset from every direction. It was critiqued by the old isolationist right, by people like Robert Taft. It was critiqued from the more activist right, by people like John Foster Dulles. It was critiqued from the progressive left, by people like Henry Wallace. It was critiqued from more the mainstream left, by people like Walter Lippmann. And all of these commentators argued that containment could not possibly succeed over the long term. Over the long term, it would exhaust us. It would deplete our resources. It would lead us into terrible dilemmas in the third world. And these critiques were not entirely wrong, of course. But of course, the United States did stick with containment over a 40-plus year period. And Americans did so not because containment was a brilliant strategy, but because it was the best of the bad alternatives. It was an alternative to the sort of diplomatic appeasement that had helped bring on World War II. It was an alternative to the sort of military escalation that might bring on a totally catastrophic World War III. Containment was a narrow path between repugnant alternatives, and that was good enough for the United States during the Cold War. Today, nobody wants a new Cold War with Russia or China because people remember how awful the old one was. But we're seeing some important things today. We're getting a reminder in Ukraine that there is evil in the world. We're getting a reminder that really nasty autocracies will advance if the United States pulls back. And we're getting a reminder that the alternative to deterring devastating wars may be having to fight them from a position of disadvantage. And I think most of all, we're seeing that the alternative to waging new Twilight struggles against Russia and China is to see those countries consign the world order that America and its allies achieved through their Cold War victory to history. I think that would lead the world to a very dark place. And so waging a Twilight struggle today is not a pretty picture, but it is a way of avoiding a future that's uglier still. So why don't I stop there, and I'd be happy to take any questions or comments about history, about the current U.S. relationship with Russia or China, anything people want to talk about.
We do have some staff members that are going to be walking around with microphones so that Hal can hear all of your questions and our online audience can hear the questions that are being asked as well. So if you have a question, just raise your hand and they'll find you with a mic.
Good evening, and thank you for your time this evening. You spent a lot of time making a detailed and persuasive argument that the last 70 years for Western democracies was successful primarily because of the concessions, the agreements, and the treaties that we made with our adversaries. And it was an ongoing process. Sometimes they were successful, sometimes we put one in place, it was ignored. But it was an ongoing process and we kept working at it. And in many cases, it removed the heat from the Cold War when it developed. My question to you is about isolating Russia and China, which is what I see going on today, and specifically our abrogation of agreements with those two countries. And again, specifically the agreement that we have with China, this goes all the way back to World War II, about Taiwan is part of China. And that's been a policy restated by every president since World War II. And the other one is with Russia, began with Ronald Reagan meeting with Gorbachev and the fall of the Soviet Union. And every president since then has face-to-face with the Russian leadership restated their commitment that even though the Soviet Union was falling apart, that those former satellite countries would not all fall and immediately merge with NATO, and Russia would be left with only its primary border against NATO, and that there would be a buffer zone of countries that may not be part of Russia, but they wouldn't be part of NATO. And NATO was not going to pursue absorbing every one of those countries, and yet since that time, something like, 13 or 18 of those countries are now part of NATO, and Ukraine is now the very last stepping stone for that reason. And if I'm looking at it from Putin's point of view, he absolutely needs Ukraine to be somewhat of a neutral country, and he had to do his actions in order to have access to the Western world. And so I'm asking you about those two agreements, the agreement with China, the agreement with Russia.
So I think these are both complicated issues. Let me try to take them one at a time. The United States does not support and has not supported Taiwanese independence, for instance, right? And so this is often referred to as our one China policy. The Chinese have their one China principle. It's very complex and arcane. But basically what it boils down to is that the United States does not want either party changing the status quo forcibly or unilaterally in the Taiwan Strait. We do not want Taiwan declaring its independence from China. We do not want China using force or coercion to try to bring about unification with Taiwan. That policy has not changed. It has been the same, as you indicated, for decades and decades and decades. Nonetheless, U.S. relations with Taiwan have changed, and particularly they've changed over the past 3 or 4 years. The United States has higher level diplomatic and military exchanges with Taiwan now than it did, say, in 2016. We've started selling Taiwan weapons more frequently than we did for large swaths of the post-Cold War era. And so when Xi Jinping says that U.S. policy toward Taiwan has changed, he's not entirely wrong. The challenge, though, is that what Chinese leaders don't see or don't choose to acknowledge is that U.S. policy toward Taiwan has changed because China's policy toward Taiwan has changed. And China has become much more assertive in trying to coerce Taiwan militarily, politically, economically. And so I think the U.S. position is that the relationship between these three parties has come out of balance. And so the United States needs to restore that balance by strengthening Taiwan's ability to maintain its de facto sovereignty and to defend itself if necessary. And in fact, this is the role that the United States has long played. And so when the United States thinks about that relationship across the Taiwan Strait, traditionally in the past, when one party has started departing from the status quo, we have stepped in to say, knock it off. And in fact, we did it to Taiwan about 15 years ago. So about 15 years ago, the then presidential administration in Taiwan gave some indications that it was thinking about moving toward a declaration of independence. And the George W. Bush administration said, don't even think about it. Right? And so one way of thinking about what's happening today is we have a different party that it's disrupting the status quo. And so the United States is trying to avoid a situation where we have the status quo collapse. It's difficult and it's complicated because we're doing things that from China's perspective are disruptive to the status quo as well. But that's the best way I can think of explaining that one. On NATO expansion, the history is kind of complicated. So I think there's a few things to keep in mind. One, during the debate over German unification in 1990, US officials and West German officials did make some statements to the effect that they did not plan on expanding NATO into what would become the former Soviet bloc. Two, there was never any international agreement to that effect. The Soviets did not demand it as the price of unifying Germany, even if they perhaps wished they had after the fact. And really by the early 1990s, it was pretty clear that the United States was in fact going to expand NATO. Did that annoy the Russians? Does it gall Vladimir Putin that has happened? Absolutely. Does that make it a bad policy? Well, maybe not, right? Because I think there are three things we have to keep in mind. The first is that it was not a given that you were going to have a relatively high degree of stability and successful democratic transitions in Central and Eastern Europe after the end of the Cold War. And I think NATO expansion played an important role in that. So there would have been costs to not expanding NATO as well. Two, if our argument is that Putin is putting pressure on Ukraine and other Russian neighbors because of NATO expansion, we're making a counterfactual argument that he would not have done that absent NATO expansion. But what worried Ukraine, what worried Poland, what worried the Baltic states was that there was a long tradition of Russia trying to dominate its neighbors, and that once Russia got back on its feet, it was going to try to do that again. And so of course they wanted protection from NATO. And so I just don't see a whole lot in Russian history that would make me think that Russian relations with the former Soviet states and with Poland and other Eastern European countries would be harmonious and peaceful today, absent NATO expansion. And the third point I'll make is that there is a reason that countries in Eastern Europe and the Baltic were literally lining up to join NATO. That they could not wait to get into America's sphere of influence because they could not wait to get out of Russia's sphere of influence. They made the judgment that it was far more tolerable, it was safer, it would be better for the development of their own democratic institutions if they were allied with a faraway democratic superpower than with the great power next door. I think they made the right judgment. I would be the first person to acknowledge that expanding NATO came with costs, but I think the benefits were higher over time.
First of all, fantastic lecture. I agree with 99% of everything that you've said up on the stage. I also particularly love your response to the last question.
I hope you'll ask me about the 1%.
No, it's a pet peeve of mine, and you only did it twice during the lecture, and where you mentioned the words communist China. Now, of course, I would argue that current China is about as communist as our neighbors to the north in Canada. I also want to touch a little bit on, you mentioned the last question where you said China has changed, and I would say that you are correct. China has a policy where it is called one country, two systems. And there was a very famous treaty that they had signed with, not from us, but with the United Kingdom over Hong Kong, which they have now extraordinarily violated. And is that kind of now what we're seeing? Is that causation? Is that what's going on now with our kind of looking and changing things a little bit vis-a-vis our relationship with Taiwan?
It's certainly changing Taiwan's understanding of what unification with China would mean. And support for unification with China and Taiwan has never been overwhelming. It's been fairly low for a couple of decades now. It is infinitesimal at the moment because people in Taiwan have seen what has happened in Hong Kong over the past 3 years in particular, and they realize that a promise of one country, two systems is not worth the paper that it is printed on. And they understand that if China is successful in reclaiming Taiwan, it's going to have horrific consequences for the political system there and for the people of that country. And in fact, Chinese officials have said openly that there would be a process of re-education of Taiwanese citizens if China reclaims Taiwan. You don't have to have a lot of imagination to think about what that might actually mean. And so this is another way in which Xi Jinping has been his own worst enemy on the Taiwan issue. Taiwan is finally starting to take its own defense seriously. It is finally starting to move more rapidly towards a serious military capability. It's developing every year a stronger Taiwanese national identity. And so if you poll people who live in Taiwan and they say, do you consider yourself Taiwanese or Chinese? A clear majority say Taiwanese, and that number gets larger every year. This is something that's happening in the shadow of Chinese pressure on Taiwan. So it's very, very relevant. And I think it's a good warning of what would happen if China were to get a hold of Taiwan. On your other point, I agree and I disagree, right? And so in some ways, obviously, China has not been an authentically communist country for a long, long time, right? And so the command economy is gone. There is, China is a radically unequal capitalist society. There are much higher levels of inequality in communist China than there are in the capitalist United States. Yeah, and so, but there's two things worth keeping in mind. We may not take the communist part of communist China seriously. The Chinese Communist Party does, though, right? And so the idea that the sort of the Leninist idea that China is a party state, that the Chinese Communist Party owns China, its own identity is inseparable from that of the Chinese state, that there can be no meaningful political opposition. That's very much a Leninist idea, even if it's not so much a Marxist idea. And so I think the best way I've heard this put is that China may no longer be a Marxist society, but they haven't ditched the Leninism part of Marxism-Leninism yet. And you can see that in the way that the CCP runs Chinese society. So yeah, you're right. It's not the sort of communist regime that we talked about when we talked about the Soviet Union or Mao Zedong's China. But it is useful to remind ourselves that China is led by a neo-totalitarian party that believes it is the only rightful leader of the country and has no intention of ever surrendering power. Let's see, we have one over here.
Isn't the threat of technological advantage gained by China a much more ominous threat than Russia, Europe situation? And if China does succeed in dominating the world globally, technologically, and we can't fire from the silos, what is the situation for this country?
I think this is one of the things that makes China such a challenge for the United States. And it's one of the ways in which this Cold War, if you will, is different from the old Cold War. So the Soviets excelled in certain areas, building really big missiles, things like that. They were never a challenge to holistically overtake the United States in science and technology, even if we sometimes worried about it in, say, the late 1950s. China has a much richer innovation ecosystem than the Soviet Union ever did. And it has invested heavily and continues to invest in a number of technologies that the CCP thinks will be central to shaping the balance of economic and military power in the coming century. Synthetic biology, advanced robotics, artificial intelligence, 5G telecommunications, you name it, right? You can go down the list, about 10 or 15 different key technologies. There is bad news and there is good news in this area. The bad news is that you can achieve a lot by throwing a lot of money at a problem and by focusing your innovation efforts in particular areas. And so we've seen that the Chinese have done fairly well on quantum computing, for instance. That's an area they've focused on a great deal. They've thrown huge amounts of resources at the problem, and they've made some pretty significant gains. And that's important for a variety of reasons, including ability to break codes and do encryption, ability to detect submarines and stealth bombers and so on and so forth. So it has real applications. The better news is that, sort of viewed holistically, China has not surpassed the United States in terms of its overall level and ability to do technological innovation. And it certainly hasn't overtaken the United States plus its most important democratic allies. And so if you look at the balance of technological research and development spending, the US versus China is relatively even. You bring in 7 or 8 close US allies, and the US plus those countries accounts for about 2/3 of the tech R&D spending in the world. And so I think the key to being successful is going to be to a deeper pooling of efforts at innovation with close American allies. On semiconductors, for instance, that may mean pooling research and development efforts with the handful of countries that are really important in advanced semiconductor supply chains: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Netherlands, countries like that. You could see a similar coalition emerge around artificial intelligence. One of the things that the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia are doing through this AUKUS partnership that they created about a year ago is trying to accelerate their development of neat military capabilities that draw on AI and things like that. If the United States is able to do that and invest in its own technological ecosystem, I have a fair degree of confidence that we will be able to maintain the technological advantage, in part because one of the things you need to do broad-based technological innovation really well is to have a free flow of ideas. And our system still has that, and China's doesn't. Maybe perhaps in the back over there.
In making comparisons to the past and what is happening now, we can look back to Stalin's purge and in the 30s and how he got rid of generals and so forth in the army. And that was obvious. Recently, they'd show pictures of Putin on one end of a long table and several oligarchs down at the other. And suddenly, many of those oligarchs were missing. And news people were calling it a purge. Is there any similarity? Do we have any insight on what's happening internally in Russia as far as power?
That's a great question. So we are not seeing anything on the scale of the great purges of the 1930s, where you had somewhere between hundreds of thousands and millions of people killed, liquidated, so to speak. What we are seeing, though, is that in both Russia and China, you're getting regimes that are more and more personalized. They are more and more structured around the choices and thoughts and will of a single individual who's been in power for a long, long time. You could see that with Putin. I don't know if anybody saw this. On the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, Putin held a meeting of his equivalent of the National Security Council, where he basically asked all of his advisors, what do you think? Should we invade Ukraine or not? And what became clear from that was that A, they are all terrified of Putin, and B, that he has no compunction about humiliating them on national TV. At the same time, we've seen Xi Jinping aggressively purge, usually not by killing, but by firing or jailing lots and lots of members at sort of the first and second tiers of the Chinese Communist Party. He's often going after his political enemies in the guise of an anti-corruption campaign. And he's gone a long way towards establishing himself as a dictator for life, or at least a dictator for 15 or 20 years in China. He's not quite as far down that path as Putin is, because Putin's had an extra decade to work at it. But I think that this is really worrying for me for a couple of reasons. And one reason is that we know that, I'll use a political science term here, autocratic decision-making deteriorates over time. Basically, layman's terms, dictators get dumber over time. Because I would make worse decisions if there was nobody willing to tell me that my bad ideas were bad ideas. It will happen to anybody. As these dictators get more powerful, as their subordinates become more and more scared of them because they fear being purged, you get less and less people who are willing to stand up and say, President Putin, this invasion of Ukraine is not going to work. This plan that we drew up on the back of a napkin is not going to succeed in overthrowing the government of this state. You get nobody who's willing to tell Xi Jinping, zero COVID is a disaster and you've got to get away from it. And so that has some pretty troubling implications, because I think it makes me worry about how accurately these leaders will be able to assess risk in crises with the United States. And they may make decisions that turn out terribly for Russia or China, but that turn out terribly for other people as well, as we've seen in the war in Ukraine. Let's make over here.
The Sino-Soviet split and the U.S. normalization of relations with China were important developments in the Cold War. And now we see China and Russia coming together, warming relations because of their common interests. My question is, do you see this as a potentially enduring alliance? And I ask in particular because it seems like Putin has given up on having normal relations with Europe.
So I don't know that it's an enduring alliance, but it might endure as long as the Sino-Soviet partnership did during the Cold War. And so the Sino-Soviet alliance during the Cold War lasted a decade or two, depending on how you count. The Sino-Soviet split really started at the beginning of the 1960s and picked up speed over the course of that decade. But before that, they had been military allies. They cooperated very closely. It has been surprising to a lot of people in Washington how close Russia and China has gotten. This is something that I think the US policy community got wrong. They didn't expect it to happen. And there are good reasons for that. So both Russia and China see the United States as their primary adversary. Both of them are autocratic regimes that want to create a world that protects autocratic regimes rather than endangering them. So there's geopolitical glue in the relationship. There's ideological glue in the relationship. And they get a lot of benefit from this partnership. So just one way of illustrating this, Vladimir Putin has stripped the Russian Far East bare of military assets right now. He can send them all to fight in Ukraine because he does not have to worry about a security threat from China. That is a night and day difference from the last 2 decades of the Cold War, where one of the reasons the Soviet Union ultimately had to call it quits was because it was competing with the United States and China simultaneously. There are huge benefits there. There are huge benefits in terms of military cooperation, economic cooperation, so on and so forth. And the fact of the matter is, neither China nor Russia has anywhere else to turn right now, because both countries have so thoroughly alienated the advanced democracies, whether that's Europe in Russia's case, China's neighbors, particularly Japan, Australia, other countries in the Indo-Pacific in its case. And so they need each other. And so I don't think this partnership is going away anytime soon. That said, I think we are seeing in the Ukraine war an indication of the strains that may eventually emerge over time. Russia and China are not natural allies, and neither, they can't both be sort of the dominant autocratic power in Eurasia simultaneously. What we're seeing in Ukraine is that there are strains in this relationship. I think the Russians are going to end up in a position of deep dependence on China, economic and technological, as a result of this war, because they essentially severed their relationship with the West. Vladimir Putin may be okay with that. A lot of Russian nationalists won't be okay with that. I think China is going to take advantage of Russian isolation, I should say, in the near term. But I don't think that Xi Jinping is particularly pleased that Putin launched this catastrophic war against Ukraine 3 weeks after Russia and China signed this joint statement saying that their partnership had no limits, which made China look complicit in the invasion. And then he handled it in such an incompetent way, Putin did. And this war is blowing back negatively against China as well as Russia. You have Australia, you have Japan, you have Taiwan increasing defense spending because they worry that what's happened in Ukraine could be a prelude to something bad happening in the Western Pacific. So you can see tensions there. I don't think this is going to make a huge difference on a 2-year timeline or on a 5-year timeline. But once you have a change in leadership in Russia and or in China, perhaps the next set of leaders is somewhat less enamored of each other. This is what happened during the Cold War, by the way. Stalin and Mao were able to get along. Okay, then Stalin dies, and Mao Zedong doesn't have the same level of respect for Nikita Khrushchev and the people who came after him. And so this isn't going to do us any good in, say, the next 5 years. We're not going to see a near-term split in the relationship. But over a 15 to 20-year period, you could start to see cracks in the relationship in the way that you did when the Sino-Soviet Alliance broke up during the Cold War. Yes?
Thank you. Thank you for speaking. First of all, in our competition with China as opposed to Russia, our economies are linked together deeply. And what are some ways that you could see that economic coupling between the United States and China to be used to the United States' advantage? Do we deepen that link? I've read in some places that if we severed our economic relationships with China, we'd be better off not only strategically because we'd be producing our own technological systems, but also that the Chinese regime relies on continued economic growth to appease the oligarchs within China. So how would you evaluate that relationship, and how could we use it to our advantage in the future?
I think this is the single most important question in the U.S.-China relationship today. My own view is that where we are headed and where we should be headed is what you can think of as a selective decoupling of the U.S. and Chinese economies. It's virtually impossible for me to imagine, short of a cataclysmic war, the degree of economic separation between the United States and China that there was between the United States and the Soviet Union during the early Cold War. China is just not an autarkic system in the way that the Soviet Union was, and the interdependence is not just so vast, it's so complicated that it's very difficult to unwind all of these supply chains and things like that. But there are areas where it is dangerous to pursue unfettered economic integration with China. I think it's insane that we invest, Americans invest in Chinese tech companies that are closely tied to the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese surveillance state. I would very much like to see that restricted more so than it is now. I think it would be terrible if Chinese 5G companies, or Chinese technology companies, Huawei for instance, were able to build the world's 5G telecommunications network. And I think both the Biden and Trump administrations were alert to that danger and took some important steps to help avert it. I don't think the United States wants to find itself dependent on China during the next Taiwan crisis for all of the chemical precursors that go into pharmaceuticals. And so Americans can't get life-saving medication if the United States and China find themselves at odds. These are all areas where we are going to have to find ways of promoting some degree of separation between the US and Chinese economies. But these are all focused areas of vulnerability. We should not try, and we do not need to try, to completely sever trade between the United States and China. And I can think of two areas where interdependence between the United States and China is actually significantly to our advantage. One of them actually has to do with universities, and it's with having Chinese students come to the United States to study. I'm perfectly willing to acknowledge that there may be cases where you have people who are actually PLA colonels come over to the United States to try to steal intellectual property, but the vast, vast, vast majority of Chinese students are here to learn. It is to our advantage to have them come here because in some cases they stay here and they enrich our society. In some cases they go back to China, but they've at least had a view of what a non-autocratic society looks like, and I think that plays to our advantage just as it played to our advantage during the Cold War. So that's an area of interdependence I'd very much like to preserve. And then another area is just trade in what you might consider non-strategic goods. It's actually to our advantage that China is so dependent on global trade for its economic prosperity, far more dependent than the United States is, because it means that if China decides to start a war in the Western Pacific, it is looking at a potentially catastrophic contraction of its economy. A lot of the studies that have been done indicate that if there's a long war between the United States and China, the US economy gets a really, really bad cold, and the Chinese economy gets a potentially fatal case of pneumonia. And so I would like the Chinese leadership to have that in mind when they are weighing the costs and benefits of aggression. I think the Chinese leadership actually understands that quite a lot, which is why Xi Jinping is trying to make the Chinese economy less susceptible to interruptions of trade, less susceptible to sanctions, in part as a result of what he's seen in Ukraine. Over here.
I'm wondering about two issues and how you think they affect China's domination. The first being not addressing air quality, the pollution. I read recently that the Yangtze River is drying up. And then the other one, the one-child policy and the aging population. China doesn't bring in immigrants, and how that will affect things.
Neither of them are going to go well for China. And so China confronts severe environmental problems in terms of pollution of air, pollution of the water. It's facing severe resource scarcity, shortages of water, even water that's suitable for use in agriculture or industry. It's running out of arable land because so much of it has been exhausted and essentially turned into desert. China faces severe environmental problems. The demographic problem may actually be worse. And so one of the reasons China was able to grow so rapidly over about a 30-year period after 1978 is it had a population that was optimally primed for productivity. Huge amounts of working age people with relatively few kids to care for and relatively few elderly relatives to care for. From an economist perspective, that is a dream. Unfortunately for China, the bill for the one-child policy is now coming due, and there are not enough people entering the workforce to replace the ones who are exiting it and getting ready to retire. And so China is going to face a situation where its population has arguably already peaked. By some models, by the end of this century, it could be half of what it is today. Even within the next 10 to 15 years, China is going to gain tens of millions of retirees and lose tens of millions of workers. That is going to create severe economic problems for China. There's never been a case of an economy that has aged that quickly and not shed a lot of growth as a result of that. It's going to create political and social strains because the Chinese social safety net is not up to caring for all of the elderly folks who are going to need assistance. And it's just going to make life much more difficult for China. And so these are two of the reasons why I'm actually relatively bullish about America's prospects and the free world's prospects in the coming decades. I think we face a period of real danger and tension with China. But if you were to ask me, would I rather have our problems or would I rather have Xi Jinping's problems? I would rather have our problems every day of the week and twice on Sunday. Yes.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I do have a question about what do you think about the sanctions for Russian population? When sanctions were addressed, Russian people lost ability to have investments, help their relatives, and I'm referring to myself. My 8-year-old father is still in Russia, only one person left. I cannot financially help or send even bouquet of roses for his birthday. So that situation, and I'm talking about average Russians, not oligarchs, of course, we don't care about them. But regular people lost ability to help out or do little transactions or buy something abroad. But literally 2-3 weeks after the sanctions were, put to the Russian society, China showed up on the market of investment, credit cards, debit cards, everything, and they pretty much flooded Russians with offers of investments, and you can put money in our banks, and lots of people, I assume, use this opportunity because the percentage that they offered were non-realistic for any economic societies. So I felt personally that sanctions a little backfired, and it brought China and Russia a little bit more together, and they became more integrated. So that worries me as well, because that kind of effect, look at the West and United States does to us with our finance, and China is welcomes to this. So what's your opinion on that?
So I guess my short answer to that would be, I believe that harsh sanctions on the Russian economy are necessary, but we need to be candid about the costs of that. They're necessary in the sense that I think it would be catastrophic if the Western world, the democratic world, were not to take a severe toll on Russia for what Vladimir Putin has chosen to do in Ukraine. And I think if you ask European leaders about this too, this is sort of a common American attitude, but it's remarkable the extent to which this attitude has become common in Europe, in places like Germany as well, where it was actually quite striking in the immediate aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. You heard lots of European politicians saying this feels like 1938, this feels like 1939. I think it really is that central to the future of the security of Europe, the future of the international order, that Russia fail and that it pay a very high price for what it has done in Ukraine. And I think it's important to attrit Russian economic capabilities over time, military capabilities, so on and so forth. So for those reasons, I think that sanctions are necessary. But the reason I really appreciate your question is that I think it reminds us that every policy has costs, and this policy has costs. It has human costs. And so when we talk about grinding down the Russian economy, let's be candid in saying that what we really mean is part of what we're doing is making life a lot harder for a lot of Russian citizens, some of whom may support the war in Ukraine, some of whom may not. And I don't know any other way to structure sanctions than to make that happen. And it's unfortunate and it's tragic, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. The other cost is that, yes, I don't see any other outcome than Russia becoming more dependent on China economically and technologically as a result of this. I wish that were not the case. I wish it were possible to drive a wedge between these two countries. I don't think it's possible at the moment for reasons that we talked about a moment ago. And so if you ask me, would I rather pay the costs of imposing sanctions on Russia or the costs of not imposing them? I'd rather pay the cost of imposing sanctions on Russia. But there are costs in the other direction as well. I think it's important that we keep that in mind.
Thank you, Hal, for joining us tonight. We deeply appreciate it, sharing your insight with us. I also want to say thank you to Dawson for sharing a slice of your story. I sat up here when I was a student in Grand Valley and did the same thing, and I recognize how difficult that is. So thank you so much, and I appreciate the student perspective. My name is Kaylor Sweeney, and as Brent mentioned, I recently joined the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies as the Common Ground Initiative Program Manager. I am deeply honored to have the opportunity to support this team in delivering this high-caliber, engaging programming we enjoyed here tonight into the future. A few housekeeping announcements before we dismiss. First, we will have Hal's book, A Twilight Struggle, available for purchase in the lobby. Hal will be on hand to sign books. I ask that those who purchase a book move through the line so that everyone who wants one has an opportunity to get one. Second, I am excited to announce a new way to engage. Look at that. Perfect timing. It scared me a little bit, but second, I am excited to announce a new way to engage with our esteemed lineup of speakers here at the Hauenstein Center. New this year is our Off the Stage podcast, hosted and produced by our own media specialist, Maddie Miller. On the podcast, speakers will share what personal passions and experiences drove them on their career journeys. The content is an honest, personal, and lighthearted look into the personalities that grace our stage. For example, I noticed that Hal happened to neglect his go-to breakfast sandwich recipe when he was talking about the secret sauce of the Americans during during the Cold War. So if you want to get that other secret sauce of that breakfast sandwich, I invite you to tune in. It goes into Hal's story in the first episode. It is now available anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can get more information about Off the Stage on our website. I also want to note an event coming up for the Ford Presidential Library and Museum. Historian Sir Anthony Beaver will be joining them virtually to discuss his book, Russia, Revolution, and Civil War, on October 11th. So you can have more information about that event at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Museum and Library website. Finally, we look forward to welcoming you all back for our Constitution Day celebration program featuring John Cowell and Wilfred Codrington III of the New York University School of Law to speak on their book, The People's Constitution, 200 Years, 27 Amendments, and the Promise of a More Perfect Union, on September 22nd at 7 p.m. here in Loosemore Auditorium. With that, I want to thank Hal once again for joining us this evening, as well as express my thanks to you all for joining us tonight, as your attendance showcases your commitment to being civically engaged and intellectually curious about the issues we face as a nation. Safe travels and have a great evening.